So, good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for those in Europe, and good even earlier morning for those in the US or other parts of the Americas. I'm delighted to welcome Elisa Paganini of the Università degli Studi di Milano. She's the author of numerous contributions to the philosophy of language, vagueness, and of course, philosophy of fiction, metaphysics of fiction. She has two books in Italian, Vaghezza and Oggetti e personaggi fittizi. And her talk today challenges an assumption most accounts of fiction take for granted, that what a work represents simply belongs to what is fictionally the case. And she will introduce this distinction between access determining reference and content determining reference, which I'm very curious to see how it will play out. So please join me in welcoming Elisa. And Elisa, once again, thank you for accepting our invitation. So let's applause, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really glad to have been invited to this occasion and to have the opportunity to present my work. And thank you to all the people who came online to listen to my presentation. So as Jersey anticipated, I'm going to put into question assumption which I take for granted in the literature of fiction, which I hope to be able to show as this one. So the assumption that if a work represents an entity, a work of fiction represents an entity, that entity belongs to what is fictionally the case. This assumption is quite difficult to, it is quite difficult to find this assumption to be explicitly stated in the works, in the literature, the philosophical literature, but in my opinion, it underlies many influential theories of fiction. And I will try to say something about why I think that this assumption underlies many influential theories of fiction. And this is the assumption I want to put into question today. So the problem I want to consider with you, and I want to convince you that it is a real problem, is that some fictional works seem to contain genuine reference to entities that do not belong to the fictional world. Examples include, imagine, and I will work on this example. I will deepen up the examples in a minute. But let me anticipate. Examples include imagined interlocutors, first-person narration, direct address to the reader or to the audience. In all these cases, what I will argue is that in order to understand these cases, we should allow that there are references within the fictional works which do not belong to what is fictionally the case. So my main thesis, my main claim today is that reference doesn't automatically generate fictional commitment. And it may be the case that a referent may be genuinely represented. It may be indispensable to understanding the work, but not determining what is fictionally the case. In order to explain this thesis, I need a distinction, and this is the proposal, that reference can play two different roles. A referent can play the role of the access guiding role, and it plays the access guiding role whenever it structures access to fictional content for the audience. While the reference play the content determining role whenever it contributes to what is fictionally the case. This is the distinction, and I will deepen it up during my presentation. It is important that the distinction between access guiding and content determining It is a distinction between roles and not types of reference. So this is for me an important clarification. So I'm not saying that certain references are access guiding and certain other references are content determining. I'm saying that this is a distinction between roles that reference can play. Some of reference play one role, some reference play the other, but there are references which play both roles simultaneously. And I will try to explain to you how this can happen. So before presenting the idea, it may first of all to say something about the existing account and why I think that the existing account tend to think that whatever entity is represented is part of the fictional content or what is fictionally the case. Even though, as I told you before, I cannot find this claim explicitly stated, but it is in a sense implicit in what is written. Kendall Walton, for example, thinks that fiction, consider fiction as props, which together with principle of generations, allows for prescription to imagine certain content. And whatever is prescribed to be imagined is what is fictionally the case. In that sense, I think that whatever is reference is prescribed to be imagined as participate, in his opinion, to what is fictionally the case. Also, Gregory Carey defines fiction as an instrument to guide imagination, and whatever we are guided to imagine is part of what is fictionally the case. Therefore, I think that Carey himself would agree that whatever is represented is part of the fictional content, or whatever is represented to be imagined or is part of what is fictionally the case. I believe that David Lewis made this idea quite straightforward in the sense that truth in fiction is defined in terms of whatever is, at least whatever is represented in fiction and explicitly represented in fiction is contributes to what is fictionally the case. Stacy Friend, in that respect, seems to me to follow Kendall Walton and defining fictional truths or as whatever is prescribed to be imagined, and therefore whatever is prescribed to be imagined contributed to the fictional content. But even if we consider the debate between ontological and realist and anti-realist, I think that even though there are clearly differences between those different approaches, for example, Thomason seems to me to be committed to the fact that whenever there is reference to a certain entity in fiction, that entity is that reference is ontological committing. But also anti-realist approach, as Walton Carey, but also Everett, seems to allow that whatever is represented in fiction is part of what is fictionally the case, even though obviously the ontological commitment is not there. So, in my opinion, within philosophy of fiction, the idea that whatever is represented is part of the fictional content seems to be quite widespread. But I found a clue in philosophy of language, an idea which I try to work on, and I think it is promising, at least for some part of what I'm going to say, an idea which has been put forward not in philosophy of fiction, but in philosophy of language, according and it has been offered by David Kaplan, John Perry, and David Lewis, who has argued that reference may serve to fix a perspective, establish a center of evaluation, without necessarily contributing to content in the same way. These ideas never, as far as I know, but you can explain if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, these ideas never been used in order to analyze fiction. And I think that this idea can be useful in order to analyze fiction. Let me say something which, over which I was not so explicit. David Kaplan, John Perry, and David Lewis argued for that thesis for indexicals. And I will use their idea for indexicals in fiction, in particular for the word I in fiction as well. Now, let me start with this idea, with this distinction between access guiding role and content determining roles which reference can play. A referent is access guiding or plays an access guiding role when it helps structure how the audience gains access to the content. It doesn't determine, or at least it doesn't need to determine what is fictionally the case. This is the idea. So the idea I will insist on this aspect is a relational idea. A referent is access guiding when what is relevant for defining as access guiding is its relation with the audience. It helps the audience to enter the fiction in a particular way without needing to determine what is fictionally the case. And now I'm going to consider examples of it, and I will try to explain to you how I think that this happens. So the first example is a film by Woody Allen, Play It Again, Sam. You see here a screenshot. If you haven't seen the film, the protagonist at the beginning sees watch Casablanca, is particularly impressed by the Bogart figure. And what happens is that from time to time, the Bogart figures show up and interact with the protagonist. And even in this case, the screenshot you are seeing, you see the Bogart figure on the right talking to the protagonist, while the woman on the left is not aware of what is going on. Now, Bogart speaks to the protagonist, but doesn't do anything within the fiction. It doesn't have any causal role, any agential role within the fiction. It's not noticed by any other character. And moreover, it doesn't interact with any other character. But even if it interacts with the protagonist, it doesn't do anything to the protagonist, just speaks to the protagonist. It cannot act directly. So in that case, what I claim is that the Bogart figure plays an access guiding role. So we, the audience, do not expect that there is a Bogart figure going around there. What is probably induced to believe is that Bogart plays an access guiding role. So that means that the Bogart figure allows the audience to enter into the conflicting, confused, quite grotesque state of mind of the protagonist without assuming that there is really a figure going on or interacting really within the fiction. So in a sense, this is an imagined interlocutor. And so let me try to say it a little bit more, express it a little bit more explicitly. Bogers appears, speaks to the protagonist, just to the protagonist, not to anyone else. Interacted only with the protagonist, not with anyone else. Structure the scene as a dialogue because he's speaking with the protagonist. But he doesn't participate in the story causal network. It doesn't function as an independent fictional agent. So he's represented because we see him on the screen, so he's clearly represented, but is not fictionally committed. His role is to allow the audience to enter into the state of mind of the protagonist without assuming or without needing to assume that it is part of what is fictionally the case. So let's go to example number 2. This is the example which has to do with first-person reference. This is the example I am more indebted to, as I told you before, Perry, Lewis, and Kaplan position. Let's suppose to read a fiction which is reported in the first person. And at a certain moment we read, I was terrified. What does the sentence do? The sentence introduces a perspective, a subject of experience. We enter into the perspective of the subject of experience. But we do not need necessarily to assume that a speaker performing an act of narration is within the fictional world. In that sense, the narrator plays an access guiding role. It allows us, the audience, to enter into the perspective without having to assume that the narrator is part of the fictional world. In that sense, it is the referent plays an access guiding role. In order to try to stress my idea, I wanted you to consider an example. This is a novel by Madeline Miller, The Song of Achilles. If you haven't read it, let me say that it is just the story of Achilles, you probably all know, but it is reported in the first person by Patroclus. At a certain moment, Patroclus dies, but the narration continues. And I wanted that we try to read together this passage in which when the narrator is already dead. Achilles weeps. He cradles me and will not eat, nor speak a word other than my name. I see his face as if through water, as a fish sees the sun. His tears fall, but I cannot wipe them away. This is my element now, the half-life of the unburied spirit. Now, what I think it happens with this passage is that we enter, as an audience, we enter the perspective of the narrator without assuming that there is a narrator within the fictional world. We do not need to assume that the posthumous narrator is there to talk to us. We just enter that perspective without assuming that a narrator is part of what is fictionally the case. The narrator allows us, in a sense, to enter the fiction without assuming that it is part of what is fictionally the case. The last type of example I want to consider are the cases in which the reader or the audience is explicitly addressed within the fiction. Let's suppose this is a very simple example. Suppose to read a fiction in which at a certain moment we read, "Dear reader, you will understand my hesitation." Here, the reader is explicitly referred to. It is important for the structure of this discourse, but it is not part of the fictional world. So again, I think that this is a case in which the referent plays an access guiding role. It allows the audience to enter the fiction in a certain way, the readers to enter the fiction in a certain way, without assuming that the reader is part of the fiction itself. So let me try to give you a general characterization of the access guiding reference, or the reference which plays the access guiding role. They are genuinely represented. They may be indispensable, so without them, we will not assess the fiction in the same way. They actually structure assessed content, but their role is not to determine what is fictionally the case. That's what the general characterization I'm proposing to you. Let me say something about those three cases. They are not exactly the same case, so there are differences among them. First person allows to enter a specific perspective, first person perspective, obviously, while the address to the audience, to the reader, usually structure the discourse, and the dialogue with imagined interlocutors allows for certain types of interpretation. So the phenomenology we experience, or the audience experience with them, is quite different. I'm not claiming that it is the same. What I'm claiming is that they share the same relational role. So even if there is a difference, phenomenological or functional difference among those cases are cases in which the reference play a specific role in relation to the audience, allowing the audience to enter into the fiction in a specific way. Now, there are two possible objections which I envisage to my proposal. You probably have more, or you may want to press the objections more during the discussion, but let me try to present you the two objections I see. They are opposite objections in a sense, and let me try to say how I would react to the objections. The first objection is inspired, let's say, by Carey's idea that fiction is a patchwork of fiction and non-fiction. And in that sense, what Carey would probably, or at least following Carey, or a Carey-like, not saying, I do not want to attribute anything to Carey, who never said, but one can say that whenever there is reference to an object which is not part of what is fictionally the case, doesn't belong or doesn't determine what is fictionally the case, those references belong to a non-fictional layer. That's what he probably would say. That's the objection I have in mind. I think that the objection is not completely adequate for the case I've been considering. Let's try just to go through them again. when we have the first person perspective with which the entire fiction is presented, we do not just experience to look at the fiction from the outside, from a narrator from which speak to us from outside, or at least doesn't seem to be completely adequate to me. It seems to me that the first person narrator allows us to enter into the fiction with a specific perspective. Or consider the case in which the reader is addressed. The reader is addressed in order to understand, to explain the situation. So what happens is that the reader enters into the fiction in a specific way, addressed in a specific way, but this is a way to enter into the fiction, not to stay outside the fiction. And also the case of Bogart, this is a case in which Bogart is clearly represented within the fiction, not outside the fiction, I would say. So I do not think that it could be claimed that these references belong to a non-fictional layer. They are represented within fiction, but they are not part of what is fictionally the case. They allow us access to the content of the fiction. On the other side, there is another objection, the opposite objection. The objection which says if references are prescribed to be imagined, they determine what is fictionally the case. This is Waltonian objection, even if obviously Walton never says something so rigid, so strong. Now, even this objection, in my opinion, doesn't capture the nature of this example. The example are cases in which references are prescribed to be imagined, therefore represented by the fiction. But they allow us to enter into the fiction without determining what is fictionally the case. So I think that this objection doesn't understand or doesn't consider appropriately the distinction between access guiding and content determining reference. Let's now consider the other type of the other roles which reference can play. Content determining reference, or reference which play a content determining role. A reference is content determining or play a content determining role when it participates in the network of relations that constitute what is fictionally the case. Many references in fiction have a content determining role, but it is now my point to explain why and how we can see the relations which constitute what is fictionally the case. Examples of this relation are interactions. So whenever there are interactions between characters, the characters are content determining. Commitment by a character usually is a commitment of a character toward another, is obviously a case in which the reference constitute or determine what is fictionally the case. Causal determinacies about entities and about between entities or between characters are obviously content are between elements or characters which plays a content determining role, and also responses which are given to other characters are obviously content determining roles. The idea is that removing the reference changes what is fictionally the case. So whenever we remove a reference which plays a content determining role, what is fictionally the case changes. That's my general definition. Now, so far I presented reference which play as an access guiding role and reference which play a content determining role. But I said that some reference can play both roles. And I want now to consider those cases. So in order to consider those cases, I think we should reconsider first-person reference. Let's consider again the sentence, I was terrified. In this case, the same reference can play both roles. As a source of perspective is access guiding. The narrator as source of perspective is definitely access guiding. But the referent as subject of experience and action is content determining. So, for example, whenever the narrator says, I was terrified, he probably was terrified by something, probably reacted to his terror in some way to the fictional events. In that sense, in being a subject of experience and action is content determining. Example of reference which plays both roles, in my opinion, are the Divine Comedy and In Search of Lost Times. In both cases, we have fiction which are reported in the first person. So they allow us to enter into the narrator perspective. So they are the reference as plays this access guiding role. But still, the narrator, the two narrators, which are also the protagonists of their respective fictions, also interact with other fictional characters and the fictional story. And in that sense, they are content determining. So reference can play both roles. Now, so far, we have discussed the reference, but I've been thinking about a sophisticated distinction which is useful to introduce. Let's consider the narrator. A narrator is usually access guiding, but is not intrinsically access guiding. A narrator can also be content determining when the narration itself belongs to what is fictionally the case. So the narrator allows us to enter the first person perspective, and in that sense is access guiding. But whenever the narration is part of what is fictionally the case, it is also content determining. An example which I thought of is Javier Cercas' The Belly of the Whale. In this novel, the protagonist at a certain moment claimed to have spent a lot of time writing the fiction. The readers are reading. So in that sense, the narrator is not only access guiding, but is also content determining. So one referent can play two roles, can play one, can play the other, can play both. Let me try to say something about this. A referent plays an access guiding role in relation to the audience. Whenever it allows the audience to assess the content in a specific way, in a certain way. That's what makes the referent to play an access guiding role. On the other side, the referent can play a content determining role. And this depends on the relation with the fictional world, because it determines what is fictionally the case. Without that reference, what is fictionally the case changes. The two roles are independent. in a sense. A referent can play only the access guiding role. In my opinion, Bogart plays only the access guiding role. The reader, whenever is explicitly addressed, the reader play an access guiding role. The reference to the reader plays an access guiding role is not part of the fiction. A referent can play only the content determining role whenever it contributes or to enter into the network of the relations which constitute what is fictionally the case. And a referent can play both roles. And as I said before, the Divine Comedy and In Search of Lost Time, in my opinion, are cases in which the narrator plays, or the referent of I, let's say, plays two roles. As a source of perspective is access guiding, and as an agent within the fiction is content determining. So far I presented these two roles, the fact that two roles are independent. One can play one referent can play one, who can play the other, can play both. There are also cases in which it is indeterminate whether a referent plays a role. And I want to consider those cases as well, because I think that those cases, instead of being counterexample to my position, are instead a way of reinforcing my position. Let me try to explain you why. So let's consider the first borderline case. This is an example which depends from an Italian novel whose title is Zeno's Conscience by Italo Svevo. It is a novel written as a form of a diary by the protagonist. The diary is written for his psychoanalyst. And no doubt, the reference of the word I is access guiding. We enter the perspective of the protagonist directly. That's no doubt about it. But what is indeterminate or can be indeterminate, whether the narrator also plays a content determining role. In this case, the diary is explicitly mentioned in the fiction. At the beginning, the psychoanalyst introduced the text saying that he publishes the diary because Zeno didn't pay him, and therefore, in order to gain the money, he decided to publish the diary. So in that sense, because one can say the diary is part of the fiction, and so the narration is playing a content determining role. But on the other side, one can say, but the diary itself is access guiding, is playing the role of allowing the audience to enter the fiction in a specific way. So what is going on here? It is indeterminate whether the narrator also plays a content determining role, depending on the role which we give to the diary and to the introduction. It depends on what? It depends on the relations we think are more important. If we think that the diary and the psychoanalyst are access guiding, they are playing the role of access guiding, then they are not really part of the fiction. They allow us to enter the fiction in a specific way. On the other side, if we take the psychoanalyst and the diary to have specific relations within the fiction, or within the network which constituted what is fictionally the case, then they are content determining. So you see the distinction between these two roles can explain the indeterminacy. That's what is important for me. Similar questions arise, similar but not the same question arise with posthumous narrators. Patroclus, we have already seen Patroclus in the Song of Achilles, but also if we think of the film Sunset Boulevard, if you haven't seen it, from the very beginning, we see a man dead in a swimming pool, and the voice of that person explaining to us what happened to him. So in those cases, again, the narrators play an access guiding role. This is not under discussion. It is not under discussion, at least it seems to me not very much problematic to question whether the narrator is part of the fiction, as I think that posthumous narrators are usually, doesn't make much sense to consider them as part of what is fictionally the case. But someone may want to say that the relations which are still present in the fictional world, namely memories, feelings, connections between the dead person and the other people surviving, allows them to be also content determined. As long as those relations are quite different from the relations which usually characterize a relation among living people, it can be indeterminate whether they play an access guiding or, whether they play also a content determining role. It is not under question whether those narrators play an access guiding role, but it is at least indeterminate whether they play the role of content determining. Another case, a borderline case, is a different borderline case, is the following, is the ghost of Hamlet's father. We can give, in my opinion, in this case, two different interpretations of this figure. On one side, one can interpret it as a genuine fictional agent. As a matter of fact, he comes on the scene, he makes a request, he speaks to his son, making requests, and therefore we can say that it, in that sense, is content determining. But there is also another interpretation, according to which the ghost is access guiding. So in that sense, the ghost is a device for structuring the drama. It helps us to enter into the state of mind of Hamlet. His feeling guilty, his desire for revenge. We understand that, those feelings through the ghost without assuming that the ghost is part of what is fictionally the case. So again, we see there are two different interpretations of what is going on, but the two interpretations are explained by the different roles which the referent can play. So those two different roles are explanatory of this indeterminacy. So in my opinion, indeterminacy is not, does not undermine the distinction I offered between access guiding and content determining roles which a referent can play. Instead, it reflects the complexity of the representation and the possibility of multiple legitimate interpretations. Roles, as I try to explain, depends on relation and not on intrinsic features of the reference. Which relations are more important may allows for different interpretations. So there may be situations in which we have to choose, or the fiction allows us to choose which relations is more relevant for the correct interpretation. So I'm going to conclude my presentation. Before concluding my presentation of the distinction between, so what I try to claim, let me say first of all, is that the reference in fiction can refer to entities, in particular to characters, which do not determine what is fictionally the case. And I try to explain that through two roles which reference can play. And what I try to convince you is that this proposal explains many aspects of fiction which are difficult to explain otherwise. Imagine interlocutors on the one side, interlocutors which we do not assume to be part of the fiction, but which helps the audience to understand the mental state of the protagonist. First-person narration, the fact that we enter into the perspective of the narrator without assuming that the narrator is part of what is fictionally the case. It explains direct address to the audience or to the reader as structuring the discourse and allowing to enter into the fiction in a specific way without assuming that the reader or the audiences are part of the fiction. It allows to explain posthumous narrators, as Joe Gillis and Patroclus we have seen. We enter into their perspective through fiction without assuming that they are, without needing to assume that they are narrators within the fiction. And also allows to explain borderline cases. It allows to explain the indeterminacy, which would remain otherwise more difficult to grasp. So what I try to convince you is that a reference in fiction is not intrinsically content determining. What matters is not simply that a reference is introduced, but the role it plays. Roles and not reference determine the contribution to the fictional content. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Elisa, for this brilliant presentation. Very good, very clear. So we have some time for questions, and I already see Andreas has raised his hand. So Andreas, please.
Yeah, no, this is just a short question about because I kind of missed it, I think. But do you think the ghost is not a fictional character in Hamlet? I mean, many other characters see the ghost, right? The ghost makes many things happen. You could have a view on which it's kind of indeterminate whether the ghost sort of exists in the world of Hamlet. But, so yeah.
Yes, this is what I'm trying to say. So that it is indeterminate whether it is the ghost is part of a fictional world. And what I'm trying to say is that this indeterminacy depends on how we interpret those events. So on the one side, as you said, the ghost is there, is on this scene, is on the stage, is therefore, and he speaks to his son, is seen also by other characters, and therefore one can maintain is content determining on that side. On the other side, there is another interpretation, according to which the fact that the ghost is seen doesn't mean that the character really saw him, but that they perceive that something wrong has been done in a sense. And it is the way in which the audience access to this fact. And also the dialogue he has with the son, we can interpret it as a way for the audience to enter the specific conflicting and state of mind of the protagonist. That's an interpretation.
Yeah.
This interpretation takes the ghost to be access guiding. I'm not saying that this interpretation is the correct one. I'm saying that we can have both, and we can have it can be indeterminate which one. And what I try to argue is that this distinction between access guiding and content determining allows to see the indeterminacy.
Okay. I think that's nice. I mean, I think it doesn't matter about the particular case of Hamlet, right? I mean, you can imagine a case where you sort of get what you want here. But I guess like maybe it's going to be tricky to distinguish such cases from cases where it's just indeterminate what's true in the fiction, right? So, I mean, there are some stories where I can't remember the name of this novel now. I might find it later, but there's a kind of, maybe you think also, sometimes people think Turn of the Screw is like this, right? Where it's sort of indeterminate whether there is a ghost there or not. And it's not, I don't think that's supposed to be an indeterminacy between whether it's access guiding or not. It's just supposed to be, you don't know whether the ghost exists or not in the fiction, as it were, right? So I guess that's another kind of case where you get the same kind of indeterminacy, but it's not the one that you're after, I think, right? Or
right, yes.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think it is useful for me. This is a useful question. I think it is useful for me to try to distinguish different kinds of indeterminacy. That's a good point. Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I have a question, if I may. So thank you for your talk. Once again, Elisa, I think those are two related questions, and I think maybe I misunderstood the way you define content determining reference, but from my notes here, I sort of could get that it matters what is fictionally the case, right? So there is this dependency, so to speak, between what is fictionally the case and which references are content determining, right? So I'm thinking about the Bogart case you mentioned. I think it's one of those examples in which, well, if the character speaks to the Bogart person, well, then is he not content determining in some way? And I think it's a similar point to what Andreas was saying about the Hamlet ghost. And whether we could describe, I think the problem is this: can we describe the content, the fictional content of this work without making reference to these characters, to these purported characters, right? And so I'm worried that there is some kind of circularity there in the way that the way we describe the fictional content determines which reference are reference determining. So it's kind of our content determining, right? So I'm worried about this circularity, and I'm thinking also about examples such as the movies. Sixth Sense, right, in which the Bruce Willis character is dead from the beginning, but it's kind of a huge plot twist. Sorry for spoiling this movie, but it's a huge plot twist, which we only discovered that he was dead all the time by the end of the movie. So it seems that it's in one sense strictly access guiding, but also in a very relevant sense, and even part of the plot twist. We could think also of the Fight Club, right? Is also content determining. So, what do you think about these examples? And maybe there is a circularity there.
Okay. So let me try to this second question first, which is, in my opinion, easier. So in the case of the Sixth Sense, what happens is that the audience comes to realize, the audience and the protagonist, to say the truth, as I remember the film, comes to realize that the protagonist and the protagonist himself realize that he's dead by the end of the film. I don't think that in this case there is anything relevantly access guiding in that. The sense that it is not the fact that we cannot have a film about dead people, as the Divine Comedy is just a travel in the afterlife. So the fact that characters are dead is not a problem in that sense. As I said, that the characters are content determining. So it is not that if they are alive, then they are content determining. If they are dead, they are access guiding. This is not the distinction. The distinction is whether they play a role in the network of the relations which constitutes the fictional world. And in that case, the fictional world is constituted by dead people. The protagonist speaks to the child who is himself dead. So in that sense, they are content determining. I do not think that they are access guiding. So for this film, at least for me, is not problematic. The other point is whether, okay, you say this is a more sophisticated question, the circularity question. So in a sense, you are right. And this is something I'm trying to think about your question while I speak. So let me. I understand that when, in the case of borderline cases, it is relevant how we describe the relations, which are relevant. So in a sense, that's correct. But there are cases in which the way we describe it is not the only aspect relevant. So for example, in the case of Bogart, it is true that he speaks to the protagonist, it is part. But it is true that it's not seen by the other characters. The other characters do not notice it, do not notice him. So in that sense, I think it can be argued in a way which is, in my opinion, where maybe you disagree, but it can be argued that it is really access guiding. It is true that he speaks to the protagonist, but it is only speaking to the protagonist, and he's even speaking to the protagonist while the other character doesn't notice it. So it doesn't make sense. What happens to the other character? Do we have to think that is stupid? or we have to think that this dialogue is not really happening in that way. So in that sense, we can argue for one interpretation. The fiction force one interpretation instead of the other. So, in my opinion, at least in the case of Bogart, it's quite evident that it is access guiding. The case of the ghost is more problematic because the ghost is seen also by other characters, and so the two interpretations are left open. That's so I would not say that it depends on, or even the first person. In my opinion, the fact that when fiction is reported in the first person, we enter into the perspective of the protagonist is something which is not the way we describe it, but it is what happens to us in a sense. And therefore, I do not think it really depends on on the way we describe. There are cases in which things are left open, and therefore we can describe the different interpretation. That's correct. But because the fiction doesn't force one relation as more important than the other. That's what I would say. I would go in that direction.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I would have a follow-up, but I'll let Enrique and Thomas ask their questions and move to the end of the line here. So yes, Enrique, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the talk. I sympathize with your view. I think it's helpful to distinguish between the two different roles. And I was thinking about an example for a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, which I really like. It's The Death and the Compass. And the story is basically a detective short story. But in a point, Borges says something like, so the city of my story, it flows a moody river or something like that. So he's kind of inserting a metafictional statement in the story. And I was thinking about the me of my story, which refers to Borges, and according to analysis, would be a case of access guiding referent, but not content terming, because obviously Borges is not part of the story. So how do you analyze that example? It would work as another set of examples of the kind of posthumous narrators and things like that?
I will have to read it again to say the truth. But yes, I think that it could play that role. It could play that role. Yeah, because if that reference to the place, if I understood correctly what you were saying, the place where it is written is relevant in order to understand the fiction. That's access guiding role. Yes, I think it will, and definitely not part of the fiction, yes. So that's, yes, I would interpret it in that way.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Thomas.
Yeah, just quick question or more of a clarification. I think it was the book, The Song of Achilles, that you mentioned as example, where the narrator dies and then continues on narrating. Would it be true to say that the narrator, like after they died, that it's still like true in that world that they wished they could like wipe the tears away of the person who holds their dead body, in that sense, where, or would that be like false, strictly speaking, in that world? I guess. Like in the fictional world.
The idea is that the dead person continues to have emotions towards Achilles in particular, and towards other characters. So, and we have the opportunity, possibility to enter that emotions. Obviously, the way in which those emotions are communicated, at least it seems to me, we cannot assume that they are communicated in the same way. But yes, obviously, if you think, well, look, after that, people do not experience anything. So that's impossible. But the point is, that within fiction, we can allow things to happen which we do not take for granted in our world. And therefore, we can imagine that a dead person, an unburied spirit, can continue to have feelings and emotions, even though it cannot express them through relations to the others in the common way. That's the way in which I enter that fiction. I experience that fiction. I do not have imaginative resistance of any kind when I read that novel. So it seems to me something which we can allow, at least in the imagination, that person continues to experience feelings. Is that?
Okay, I just wanted to clarify because I wasn't sure how your position would handle that. So I agree. But yeah, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, Iago?
So, thank you, Elisa. I don't think my question is a good question. It was something I was thinking about while listening to your presentation. So, don't you think you can this access dimension is better? I don't know, is better represented or something like that by a mode of presentation and not really the reference, because I kept thinking about these Frege cases and stuff like that, and it seems like the content part is certainly the referent, at least inside of fiction. This access guiding thing seems to me, I don't know, similar to some cognitive notion related to mode of presentation or something like that. Can't you, I don't know, distinguish between those two things?
All right. Okay. Let's take sensor reference, Frege sensor reference. According to Frege, a name refers because it allows for it has a way of presenting itself. And that's the way in which the name refers to the object, through the way in which the reference presents itself. So that's the idea. Now, so for example, the evening star, the morning star, so are two ways in which the referent is presented to us. So as the first or the last shining star in, let's say, star in the heaven. Now, what I'm trying to say is that the fact that the reference appears in a certain way and have certain properties is something which probably everybody would agree on. It doesn't distinguish my opinion or my position from the main team. When I say that, for example, the word I allows to enter the fictional content through a perspective, a first-person perspective, I'm not saying that the referent is presented in a certain way. What I'm trying to say is something different. The referent, in a sense, disappears. And we enter the perspective without a reference. That's the idea. So when we say the reference, so when we read, I was terrified, I was, people wanted to kill me, and I've seen them. I was terribly terrified and worried about that. I was trying to think about how to react and how to solve the situation. What we do is to enter into the perspective of the narrator without assuming that there is someone who is explaining to us what is going on. So it is not what the access guiding is not necessarily a way in which the object is present itself. And also the case of Bogart. It's not that the state of mind of the protagonist, the Woody Allen protagonist, is shown, is presenting itself in that way. But the fact is that we assess that state of mind through that dialogue with the Bogart figure. So it is not the referent who is presenting itself in a certain ways. That's what allows the referent to be access guiding. Is that the referent, in a sense, disappears in order to allow to see something else. So the Bogart case is a case which is more evident, in my opinion. So if you allow, the Bogart case is a case in which we think that Bogart is not there, definitely not there. He's uncertain about what to do in order to present this uncertainty, and his ideal is what he has in mind is introducing, the director is introducing this Bogart figure, which is for us, but not for in order to understand what is fictionally the case. In the case of I, when I is access guiding, it allows us to enter the perspective without assuming that there is a narrator, while what we know from philosophy of language usually is that the word I refers to the speaker, but the speaker in that case disappears, or and the narrator disappears, and we enter the perspective. And also the case in which the reader is addressed, is a case in which it doesn't make sense to say that the reader is part of the fiction. It is a way in which we assess to the content of the fiction. That's the idea. So I would not, I think that there is a difference between sense, Fregean sense and what I'm proposing. According to Fregean sense, there are certain properties an object have, the identifying properties, which allows the name to refer to a certain referent. What I'm trying to say is that in the case of referents which play an access guiding role, the referents are presented to the fictional audience, the fictional users, but they are not part of what is fictionally the case. They disappear in a sense. They allow us to enter, but then we do not want them in the fiction. That's what happens.
I got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just to as a follow-up to my question previously, so regarding the content determining versus content determination in respect to the way we describe a fiction. So it seems to me that your distinction will require us to postulate what sorts of relations and what sort, perhaps causal relations in the fiction, what sorts of relations are relevant to determine the content, right? Much like yesterday we were talking about Merrill's examples, in which the chronology of events inside the fiction is relevant for some things to come out as true or not. I think you have a similar question about what is causally relevant or what is fictionally relevant in order to be included as content. And if I had, for example, this Lewisian view, as I understand, perhaps it's a way to describe your distinction, and correct me if I'm wrong, but on a Lewisian view, the access determining access guiding role in principle could be played by any other element of this fictional world, so to speak. Like we could choose very different perspectives in this possible world, which is being described as which has been told as a true story, and so on, in the Lewisian account. So what is part of the world is the content determining part, and the access guiding part is like this perhaps shifting or shiftable perspective on the events. Is that what you're aiming for?
Right. So the point is that the access guiding, as I try, there are the general idea, you got the general idea, but, and you said many things, but let's start with the access guiding, which is the one which worries me more, but then I go back to the content determining, what you said about the content determining, which is very important. In the case of access guiding, I'm not requiring that access guiding or every reference which plays an access guiding role plays that role in a phenomenological or functional uniformity. This is something which makes my proposal a little bit more complex, but the fact is that the situations, what I'm trying to say is that the situations, the examples I've given are phenomenologically quite different among themselves. So that's something I'm quite aware of. What connected those examples, which are different, is the fact that in those cases, the reference allows the audience to enter the fiction in a certain way, and they do not at least not necessarily be part of what is fictionally the case. That's the definition of access guiding. So, and I allow for the different access guiding reference to play this role with phenomenological and functional differences. Okay, that's. Now, what you're saying about the fictional content, so you have to give a definition of fictional content. Now, if I have to do that, I'm not going to, or if you try to, if a referee try to force me on that, that's something which obviously I'm not going to do, and I'm not able to do, because, as you said, there are different definitions, different possibilities. There are even different intuitions about what is fictionally the case. So what I'm trying to say is, whatever is fictionally the case, my general assumption is that in order to something to be fictional, it should belongs to the causal and relational networks which constitute such a world. Now, if you want to say, well, but I want to know exactly which, how those relations are and which one are inside and inside, this is something which I confess I'm I'm not able to do it. My idea is in a sense neutral with respect to that definition. I think that whatever definition one adopt, there should be space for us as guiding rules for reference.
Yes, that's great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
So
you are touching a point which I know if someone pressed me on that, that's
yes,
something. But I know, I mean, I'm not able, but it is very difficult to find it also in the literature, complete and so definition on that.
yes, I agree, and I was just thinking about your examples about dialogue, and so if I talk to an imaginary person, isn't that in some sense a causal relation? That's what was on the back of my mind. So if you only stick to causal relations, but isn't speaking also some sort of causal relation? So that's
yeah, you can try to press that. So the point is how much you want the interlocutor to be an imaginary interlocutor for the speaker. If it is imaginary and you see the imaginary interlocutor, then the imaginary interlocutor is doing what whoever imagined want or expect them to do. If it is a phantom, things or a ghost, things are more difficult because in that case, it is not clear whether fiction introduces a supernatural being, that's a possibility or not. So, even what it is, if it is an imaginary interlocutor, is not part of what is fictionally the case. It is part of what is mentally assumed by the protagonist. That's clearly the case. But is not part of the relations which constitute the fictional world. If it is a supernatural being, things are more complex. So how can we interpret the supernatural beings? And the case of the ghost is a case like that. We can have in fiction supernatural beings, and we have a lot of supernatural beings in fiction, but also those supernatural beings can be instrumental in order for us to assess the fictional content. That's
Yes. I think there will be a sort of a dependency on genre as well, right? So if you're talking about supernatural fiction, you will include things that are not usually included in the fictional content, right? So, but we have a question from Leandro. Leandro, please.
Thank you. I may be confused,
Oops.
but maybe it will help clarify. I understand that you're saying that there may be two roles for reference in general, the access and the content determined. And in the discussion, and maybe I understood it the wrong way, but it feels like to defend the unique role of the access and guiding role, the objections were about if, let's say, that the narrator is part of the fictional world or not, or is part of the content. But I think that is not the issue here, because I will follow Pradelli's terminology, like the narrator can be in the periphery, not be part of the content, but have the role of determining content. So maybe I got confused in these two different things, because one cannot be part of the fictional story, but determine content. So you can have the role of determining content without being a content in the fiction. And I don't know if I get it right or I'm just confused, but I want to clarify maybe these things.
right. So according to Pradelli, as you said, the narrator is on the periphery. Therefore, is not within the fiction, but it is outside fiction. That's the claim is making. The fact is that within the fiction, when we read the fiction, we assess, at least if the narrator is speaking in the first person, because the narrator can be omniscient or can speak in the third person. But if the narrator speaks in the first person, we have access to his perspective. And his perspective is part of the fiction. Okay. Is the narrator outside the fiction? Do we need the narrator to be outside at the periphery? Or the narrator is just an instrument and we do not really need it? My proposal is that whenever we have narrator in the first person, the narrator is referred to into the fiction when he uses the word I, but need not be part of what is fictional in the case. And it allows to assess the fiction through a perspective. And it can also be in certain, as agent, content determining. So consider the fact, usually when the narrator is in the first person, is reporting his interaction with other characters. That's the usual way, let's say. Maybe there are cases in which things are different, but at least the usual way is like that. There are exceptions, but let's consider those cases. In those cases, what happens is that whenever we enter his perspective, the narrator is not part of the fiction, but as an agent interacting with other characters, as a subject of experiences, is part of the content. So that's my idea. Whether you want to maintain the narrator outside on the periphery, I don't think you need to do that. Once the narrator is just an instrument to enter the fiction, why do you need to maintain the narrator outside the fiction? I don't see. Do you have any other? Do you think that we need the narrator outside the fiction?
No, I don't think that we need to. I think sometimes it may happen, but not outside the fiction. I think, like you say, it's kind of represented. Some narrator, not every narrator, but some narrators are kind of represented fictionally at some point, but not in the same level in the fiction. Let's say like there are different levels of fictionality, and I put the example of periphery. Maybe it's not necessary, but periphery is like the access way for Brodelli in your terminology. We don't need to establish the periphery, but like this access role that is not part of the story world, let's say, or the fictional world, but allows the reader or the audience to enter. That was the question. I mean that because when you put the two objections for the access alone, like what you are proposing, and you put the objection that Walter's objection that you should put the narrator as part of the fictional world, and I agree with you that it's not necessary. And the other one that I don't remember the other one. I have it here. Stock is here. Carry like.
Carry like.
The not fictional layer that you also don't need because there's this what I say periphery or this other level that is not story world and is not reality or not fiction. So it's not in the fictional world, but it's some kind of fictional because it's representation, not about reality. So I agree with you. I'm not doing a critic, but I think that those objections don't go against saying you are not putting that narrator like in the determining content role because you can be in that layer and still determine content. It's not necessary. I mean, that is why I think that there are two different things. One thing is like, let's say, the ontology, or where you put the existence of this narrator, and the other one is if it's having the role of determining content. Because I think if the audience only has the access to the fictional world with that narrator, I don't see another way of determining content than by the words of this narrator. That is what is confusing me a little bit.
Right. Yes, I think I should consider more deeply the objection that the narrator is neither outside nor inside, but it is at the periphery at a certain fictional level. There are layers of fictional level. I should take this objection more. It is more sophisticated than I presented it, and I agree with you that I should consider the objection more deeply. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. So, Andreas, please.
Really? Okay. Yeah, no, this was just I mean, this was just more in the same vein. And I kind of think sometimes that things are just getting more complicated than they need to be. I mean, I don't really see. So, like, if you take Dr. Watson, right? Clearly, it's true to say that Doyle created a fiction in which Dr. Watson wrote the stuff that we're reading, right? Okay. So now you can ask yourself, well, what else is true in this fiction? And I mean, given the information that we have, right, like what he writes and all this kind of stuff, we don't have any reason to believe really that he's like lying to us or being massively unreliable. So, you know, we just sort of think, okay, in this fiction where Dr. Watson wrote the stuff that we're reading, you know, the stuff that he's writing about also happened. But I don't see any reason I mean, in that case, of course, there's no sense in which he's outside or something like that, right? I mean, but in a case where there is reason to think that some kind of first-person narrator is just massively lying or being unreliable or so on, I don't see why you should think that there is some sense in which he's outside or something like that, right? It's still just a case where the author created a fiction in which the first-person narrator wrote the stuff that we're reading. And then, you know, what else is true in this fiction might be different from what they tell us, right? And we have ways of inferring that. I mean, and if the author wanted to convey that to us, they make it, that's what being skillful as an author is, right? Is being able to, you know, we see what the first person narrator writes, but we're able to infer that what's actually true in this fiction is something else. But I don't see why I should think that, oh, that means, you know, there's a periphery. I never really understood that. It's just there is a fiction, and inside this fiction, the first person narrator, you know, has written the stuff that we're reading. And then other things are true in this fiction too. And, you know, that's up to us to infer. I mean, Leandro is right that, I mean, okay, the only access we have, in some sense, the only access we have is the words of this first person narrator. But the point is that we can make inferences, right? I mean, and, you know, and that's what a narrator does. Sorry, an author does, right? Is to make sure that the narrator gives us words from which we're able to infer, you know, that, oh, that didn't actually happen, you know, or something like that. I never understood this whole, the whole need for, I mean, if you want to say there's a layer of fiction in that case, I don't really understand either why there's one fiction, you know, and inside this fiction, there's a Dr. Watson type person who's written all the stuff that we're reading, and then we infer what else is true in this box, you know, like Sherlock Holmes did this and Sherlock Holmes did that. I don't know. So yeah.
Right. In the case of Watson, the situation is simple. So Watson is a narrator. It's not a first-person narrator, so it's not access guiding. It's just reporting as a narrator. In the case of the lying narrator, well, obviously we need to consider specific cases, but it seems to me that we have to, in that case, the narrator, if he speaks in the first person, that's relevant. If he speaks in the first person, he's lying. There are reasons which the referent as content determining has to lie as guiding. So there may be this, but I have to think about it better.
I mean, of course, if you have a first-person narrator and you realize that they're lying to you, of course you're able to distinguish between the yarn that they spun, right? And the, what's true
Yes,
fiction.
I'm not denying that.
Normal lying. There's no sense in which I think, oh, there's two fictions within each other, So
No. In the case, if the narrator can be part of what is fictionally the case. In that case, the narrator can be lying in his commitment within the fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I have yet to see why I need this Pradelli periphery. I don't get it, to be honest, right? I don't understand it. And also, I don't get either, but there's another story, but I don't get either the sort of Curry fictional author or whatever he calls it, which is a sort of a character inside the fiction. I don't get that either. So that's just me being like, I don't see why we need these things. Okay. Sorry.
Okay, that's good.
That's
good.
just me reporting, what I think. But yeah, okay. No arguments. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. They were really useful for me. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Elisa, once again for your presentation, for your responses. Let's have a round of applause. And so yeah, this concludes this session. Thank you for all the presenters this morning as well. And we will reconvene at 1:30 p.m. here in Brazil. Check your time zones for equivalences there, with a session with Renato, Pedro, and Thomas. And then later we will have the presentation by Professor Zalta. So see you all this afternoon, and have a nice lunch for those of you in Brazil, and other meals or other breaks for people elsewhere.